The champagne glass slipped from my hand and shattered on the marble floor. 300 people turned to look at me. And in that moment, standing in the middle of my son's graduation reception, I realized that the woman across the room had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this story really begins. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I'm 63 years old, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades working, waiting, and keeping a secret that I swore I would take to my grave. I almost did. But some secrets have a way of finding the surface on their own, no matter how deep you bury them. I grew up in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. My mother was a seamstress. My father drove a delivery truck until his back gave out, and then he drove one anyway because we needed the money. I learned early that life doesn't hand you much, and what it does hand you, you hold on to with both hands. I met my husband Thomas when I was 22. He was kind and funny, and he smelled like pine soap and motor oil, and I loved him so completely that I didn't know where I ended and he began. We got married in the backyard of my parents' house on a Saturday in June. My mother made my dress. My father cried. It was the happiest day of my life up until that point. We had our son Nathan 2 years later. Thomas held that baby and looked at me like I had personally hung every star in the sky. We were not rich. We were not even close to comfortable most months. But we had each other, and in our little house on Birchwood Lane, that felt like enough. Then Thomas got sick. It started with headaches, then fatigue, then a doctor's visit that turned into more doctor's visits, and then a diagnosis that sat in the middle of our kitchen table like something none of us knew how to move around. Glioblastoma. Stage 4. The doctors gave him 14 months. He lasted 11. Nathan was 4 years old when his father died. 4 years old. He doesn't remember the sound of Thomas's laugh. He doesn't remember the way Thomas used to carry him on his shoulders through the grocery store, pretending to bump his head on every aisle sign on purpose, just to hear the boy giggle. Those memories belong only to me now, and I carry them carefully, the way you carry something irreplaceable. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming and the neighbors went back to their own lives, I sat down at my kitchen table and I did the math. I had a 4-year-old, a mortgage, $1,100 in a checking account, and a part-time job at the front desk of a medical clinic that paid $9 an hour. The math did not add up, so I changed the math. I enrolled in a nursing program at the community college. I studied after Nathan went to sleep, textbooks spread across the kitchen table under the yellow overhead light, while the house was quiet, and the clock on the microwave blinked toward midnight. I worked the front desk during the day, picked Nathan up from my mother's house in the evenings, made dinner, gave baths, read stories, waited for him to fall asleep, and then I opened my books again. It took me 3 years longer than it should have. There were semesters I had to drop because Nathan got sick, or the car broke down, or the clinic cut my hours, and I needed to pick up weekend shifts at a diner 2 towns over, just to cover the electricity bill. But I finished. I became a registered nurse at the age of 31, and I cried in the parking lot of the testing center for 20 minutes before I could drive home. Nathan grew up watching me work. I want you to understand that about him. He watched me leave the house before sunrise. He watched me come home after dark. He watched me study and budget and negotiate with bill collectors and smile through exhaustion. And he grew into a young man who understood, in his bones, what it meant to earn something. He was brilliant, not in the way proud mothers say their children are brilliant, though I was certainly that. He was genuinely, measurably brilliant. He won a full academic scholarship to the University of Virginia. He graduated summa cum laude with a degree in biochemistry. He was accepted into medical school at Vanderbilt on his first application. When he called me to tell me, I was standing in the break room at the hospital where I had worked for 22 years, and I sat down on the floor right there between the vending machine and the coffee maker, and I wept. I had done it. We had done it. Everything I had sacrificed, every night I had chosen textbooks over sleep, every birthday party I had left early to cover a double shift, it had built something. It had built him. Nathan met his fiancée, Claire, during his 3rd year of residency. She was a hospital administrator, sharp and organized and capable in a way I recognized and respected. She made my son happy, and that was what mattered most to me. I welcomed her. I learned how she took her coffee. I remembered her sister's name and her favorite restaurant and the fact that she was allergic to tree nuts. I tried, genuinely and without reservation, to love her as a daughter. Her family was a different matter. Claire's mother, Patricia Holloway, was a woman who had never once in her life worried about money. I say that not with bitterness, only with accuracy. She had grown up wealthy. She had married wealthy. She moved through the world with the particular ease of someone who has never had to calculate whether they can afford both groceries and the electric bill in the same week. She wore it without knowing she wore it, the way people do when comfort has simply always been the air they breathe. The first time I met Patricia was at an engagement dinner at a restaurant in Nashville that charged $40 for a bowl of pasta. I wore my nicest dress, the navy one I had bought on sale 3 years prior for a hospital fundraiser. Patricia arrived in cream silk and pearls, looked at me exactly once with an expression I can only describe as an assessment, and then spent the rest of the evening speaking mostly to her husband. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was projecting, that I was defensive because I already felt out of place in that restaurant, already calculating in the back of my mind how much this dinner was going to cost my son. I smiled. I was gracious. I asked Patricia about herself and listened attentively to her answers. But over the following months, as the wedding planning progressed, the picture became clearer. Patricia had opinions about everything. The venue she preferred, the estate outside of Franklin where she had attended 3 charity galas. The flowers she wanted, peonies, though Claire had always loved wildflowers. The guest list, she kept adding names I had never heard, people from her social circle, business associates of her husband's, a cousin twice removed who lived in Connecticut. When I gently suggested that perhaps Claire and Nathan should have more say in what their wedding looked like, Patricia smiled at me with her mouth only and said, "Of course, Dorothy, we just want the best for them." I let it go. I kept letting it go, because Claire loved Nathan, and Nathan was happy, and the details of a wedding were not worth the damage a conflict would cause. What I could not let go was the seating arrangement. I discovered it 3 days before the wedding when Claire, flustered and apologetic, pulled me aside at the rehearsal dinner and told me there had been a change. I would not be sitting at the head table with Nathan and Claire and their wedding party. I would be at table 7. In the back half of the room, across the venue from my son. Patricia felt the head table was getting crowded, Claire said, and she couldn't quite meet my eyes when she said it. She said it was about aesthetics, the symmetry of the table. I looked at my future daughter-in-law, this woman my son loved, and I saw that she was embarrassed. Not embarrassed enough to fix it, but embarrassed. "Of course," I said. "Table 7 is fine." It was not fine. But I said it was, and I meant to leave it there. The wedding was beautiful. The venue was the estate Patricia had wanted, all white columns and manicured hedgerows, and a tent strung with lights that turned gold in the early evening. There were 300 guests. I knew perhaps 12 of them. I sat at table 7. I watched my son marry the woman he loved from a distance. I could see the back of his head during the ceremony. When he cried, and he did cry, because he is Thomas's son, in every way that matters I could not see his face. At the reception, I ate my dinner at table 7 and smiled at the strangers around me and answered their polite questions about how I knew the couple. I said I was Nathan's mother. Some of them seemed surprised by this information, as if a mother at table 7 was something that required recalibration. Then Patricia stood up to give her speech. She spoke beautifully. She talked about Claire's childhood, her accomplishments, the qualities that made her exceptional. She talked about the Holloway family and their history and their values. She talked about what this union meant to them. It was polished and warm and lasted nearly 8 minutes. Then she said, almost as an aside, her eyes drifting briefly toward the back of the room, "Nathan, of course, comes from modest beginnings. We're so glad he found his way." 300 people heard that. Some of them laughed softly, assuming it was a compliment. Nathan's jaw tightened. Claire looked at her plate. And I sat at table 7, in my nicest dress, with my hands folded in my lap, and I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in a very long time. Not grief, not insecurity, something quieter and more deliberate, something I recognized from those nights at the kitchen table, studying by yellow light while the rest of the world slept. Clarity. I had kept a secret for many years. Not the kind of secret born from shame, the kind born from protection. When Nathan was 12, I had stumbled across something in the course of my work that I had not known what to do with. A patient, a name, a connection to a man I had known only by reputation who had, it turned out, built that reputation on a foundation that would not survive scrutiny. Gerald Holloway, Patricia's husband, Claire's father, had spent the 1990s as a mid-level administrator at a regional hospital network in Georgia. During that time, a series of billing irregularities had been investigated and quietly resolved. Resolved, I later understood, because a certain amount of money had moved in certain directions. One of the nurses who had initially raised the concerns, a woman named Ruth Mackey, had lost her job. Her license challenged on fabricated grounds, her career ended at 44. I had met Ruth at a continuing education conference in 2009. She had told me her story over lukewarm coffee in a hotel ballroom in Chattanooga. I had not known, when she told me, that her story would one day intersect with mine. I had simply listened and felt the particular fury of someone who knew what it cost a woman to build a nursing career and understood exactly what had been taken from Ruth Mackey. I had kept her contact information. I had kept the notes I wrote down that evening. I had filed them in a folder in the back of my desk drawer and not thought about them again for years. When Nathan first brought Claire home and told me her last name, I had gone to that drawer. I want to be clear about what I did next and what I did not do. I did not go looking for ammunition. I did not immediately reach out to Ruth or to the journalists she had eventually connected with, who had written a small regional piece that went largely unnoticed. I was careful. I was patient. I watched Gerald Holloway sit at dinners and make toasts and accept congratulations on his daughter's engagement, and I waited to see who he was. What I saw was a man who looked at my son the way Patricia looked at my navy dress, assessing, categorizing, finding acceptable, but only just. And then Patricia stood up in that tent full of light and crystal and 300 witnesses, and she told the room that my son came from modest beginnings, as if modest were something to be managed rather than honored. I stood up. I did not plan to. My body simply decided before my mind caught up. I was on my feet, and the champagne glass I had been holding had slipped from my fingers and shattered on the marble, and every face in that tent turned toward table 7. Patricia looked at me. Her expression cycled through surprise and then irritation and then a smile, the kind of smile that is really a question. "What do you think you're doing?" I picked up the wireless microphone that the DJ had left on a nearby stand. I don't know why it was there. Providence, maybe. Thomas always said I had good timing. "I'd like to say a few words," I said. My voice was steady. I had not known it would be. I had spent 30 years of nursing staying calm in rooms where things were falling apart, and I suppose it had become the thing I did automatically when the stakes were highest. I looked at Nathan first. He was watching me with an expression I had seen on his face exactly once before, when he was 9 years old and had climbed to the top of the oak tree in our backyard and looked down and realized how high he had gone. Not afraid, simply aware of the height. "My son does come from modest beginnings," I said. "He comes from a 2-bedroom house on Birchwood Lane where the heat sometimes didn't work in January. He comes from school clothes bought at the end of summer sales and vacations that were drives to my mother's house in Knoxville. He comes from a kitchen table where his mother studied for nursing exams after he went to sleep, because someone had to make sure the light stayed on and the mortgage got paid, and that little boy grew up knowing that the people who love you don't stop when things get hard." The tent was very quiet. "What he does not come from," I continued, "is the kind of beginning where the people around you cover up their mistakes by destroying someone else. He does not come from that." I made sure of it. Gerald Holloway's face had changed. He had been watching me with the polite attention of a man waiting for something boring to be finished. Now he was very still. "I spent 28 years as a registered nurse," I said, "and in that time I met a woman named Ruth Mackey. Some of you may not know that name. Gerald does." The stillness in the room shifted into something different, the kind of quiet that has weight. I did not say everything I knew. I did not need to. I said enough. I said Ruth Mackey's name, and I said the name of the hospital network, and I said the year, and I watched Gerald Holloway's face go the color of old ash. "I kept notes," I said. "I keep very good notes. It's a nursing habit." And over the past 2 years, I have been in contact with Ruth and with a journalist at the Tennessean who finds the story very interesting. I paused. I had planned to let the appropriate people handle it through appropriate channels, quietly, without anyone's wedding being involved. That was my preference. Another pause. Patricia changed my preference this evening. I set the microphone down. I walked back to table 7. I sat down. I picked up my fork because I had not finished my dinner, and the chicken was actually quite good. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Nathan stood up from the head table and walked across the entire reception to where I was sitting, and he crouched down next to my chair the way he used to when he was small, and wanted to tell me something important, and he said quietly so only I could hear, "You kept notes." "I always kept notes," I said. He laughed. It was Thomas's laugh, and it hit me in the chest the way it always did. The reception continued, because receptions do. Gerald and Patricia Holloway left within the hour. Claire cried in the coat room, and not only from sadness, there was relief in it too, the particular release of something a person has been quietly carrying. Nathan held his wife and looked at me over her shoulder, with an expression I did not need to interpret. In the weeks that followed, the journalist published her piece. It was not a small regional story this time. Ruth Mackey was interviewed. Documents surfaced that had not surfaced before. Gerald Holloway's name was in it. His lawyers responded, as lawyers do. The process was long and imperfect and ongoing, as these things always are. But Ruth Mackey called me the day the article ran. She had retired by then, had a small garden in Asheville, and 2 grandchildren she sent me photos of sometimes. She cried on the phone, and I cried too, and we stayed on the line for a long time without saying much, because some things don't need words. Claire and I had a long conversation, just the 2 of us, on a Sunday afternoon in her and Nathan's kitchen. She told me she had known something was wrong with her father for a long time, the way children know things they can't name. She had not known what. She asked me why I had waited. I told her the truth, because it wasn't my story to tell on someone else's timeline, and because I had not wanted to hurt her, and because I had hoped I would never need to tell it at all. She nodded at that for a long time. Then she said, "Thank you for protecting Nathan." I looked at this young woman, who was brave enough to stay married and brave enough to face what her family was, and I said, "That's what mothers do." I am 63 years old. I live in the same 2-bedroom house on Birchwood Lane where I raised my son, though I fixed the heat. I have a garden that Thomas would have laughed at because I was never patient enough for gardening when he was alive, and now I spend entire Saturday mornings in it without noticing the time. Nathan and Claire have a daughter now, 8 months old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. They named her Rose Dorothy. Last month I was at their house for Sunday dinner, and after we ate, Nathan carried little Rose out to the porch and sat down in the rocking chair there, the baby on his chest, exactly the way Thomas used to hold him. I stood in the doorway and watched them, and I thought about the kitchen table and the yellow light and the textbooks and the mortgage and the $1,100 and all the years I had spent building something in the dark, not knowing exactly what shape it would take. It took this shape, this man, this child, this porch. Some people would say I should have spoken sooner. Some people would say I should have stayed quiet at that reception, let it pass, not made a scene. I have heard both opinions, and I understand them, and I don't regret what I did. Thomas used to say that the right moment announces itself, if you're paying attention. He was right about most things. He was right about that. I paid attention. For 30 years, I paid attention. And when the moment came, I was ready for it. That is what modest beginnings teach you, if you let them. Not shame. Not deference. Patience. Endurance. The knowledge that you have already survived the hardest thing, and that the woman standing across a lit tent with her pearls and her silk and her practiced smile has no idea what you are made of, she found out.